Marilie Coetsee writes and teaches in the areas of social and political philosophy. She examines the question of how citizens should navigate important political disagreements and focuses in particular on the obligations that pertain to religious citizens when they engage with secular interlocutors. Are we obligated to reconsider our controversial beliefs in the face of political disagreement? When and to what extent must we empathize with those who hold opposing, perhaps problematic views? Should laws be supported by justifications that citizens from a variety of religious and philosophical worldviews can reasonably be expected to accept? Dr. Coetsee's inquiries about these questions led her to do research in the philosophy of religion, epistemology, and philosophy of the mind. She is also interested in the duties democratic societies have to engage with illiberal citizens and in Islamic ethics and political philosophy. Dr. Coetsee's articles appear in a variety of journals, including Oxford Studies in Metaethics, Philosophy and Social Criticism, Islamic Law and Society, and the International Journal for the Philosophy of Religion. She is under contract with Routledge for a book titled Does Faith Belong in Politics? Religious Participation in Pluralistic Polities. Welcome, Professor Coetsee.
Press the on button, that's how it goes? Yeah, okay. It's amazing how that works. What's that? Non-religious decision, yeah. It's pure technicality thing. Hi, everybody. Yeah, I'm Marilie Coetsee. I'm super glad to be here. I'm going to be talking to you today about religion and political polarization. To get us started, I'll just give you a little bit of my personal background. So I'm an immigrant. I was born in South Africa. We moved a lot, finally ended up in California, and we found this church, San Jose Christian Reformed Church, which some of you guys are probably familiar with the CRC tradition. It's a Dutch background tradition, and my parents, who hadn't made any friends in the US, all of a sudden started to make a lot of friends because it was the same denomination that they had grown up in South Africa. And these people are my family. I love them. They're super dear to my heart. There was a lot of great features about this church. People, at least to my experience, really showed unconditional love to other people in the church. They were also pretty frank with each other, pretty honest, have conversations about a variety of things. So these are great features. I love this church, and I still do. So as I grew up in this church, then I went to secular school. This is at Stanford with my two best friends, Nima Rahimi and Preetam Sarma. Nima is a Muslim from Iran, and Preetam was a Hindu from India, or at least his parents were from India. I also super duper cared about these people. They were also immigrants. We shared a lot of kind of like experience over that. But I was sometimes super sad because sometimes the love that I saw people show other people in the church didn't always translate out to my friends. So sometimes when people talk about non-Christians, it was like, ooh, the non-Christians, or like the Muslims or whatever. And I'm just like, whoa, that felt weird, like what's happening? Similarly, how people talked inside the church wasn't always as nice to people who are coming from outside of the church. I sometimes felt like they didn't really listen to my friends were very good people. They really were very thoughtful. But it kind of felt like people sort of blocked out, what people who were non-Christian or people like my friends would have said. This made me sad. So it's something I'm really interested in is how the church can do better, maybe, with taking all the good things I think it's got to offer and exporting it with respect to people in a broader society. So that's sort of where I'm coming from, why I'm interested in this. I just want to get maybe two hands just to get you guys all participating a little bit at the beginning, maybe one guy and one girl. Why are you here? Why do you care about polarization? Does this affect you? Got one up here.
It affects that country in a super negative way.
Yeah, okay, super negative way. Have you experienced any negative effects of it? Anyone experienced negative effects of it? Let's see, is there any ladies? feel like this happens in my class a lot.
Well, the real,
Yeah.
for example, here in this state, we had the opportunity to vote for whether or not we wanted abortion.
Mhm.
And although my family are really solid Christians, the women in my family really felt that this was really not a religious decision,
Mhm.
that this was really a
Yeah.
personal decision that each woman had a right to make. And so in my case, I sat down with them and I explained to them my position and their position. I've said, we just have to agree to disagree
Mhm.
on this particular point. And that's where I see the schism between religion and politics.
Mhm.
In that one specific area of
Yeah.
abortion.
So abortion is one of the most polarizing issues in the US for a lot of people. If you go interview people, a lot of people, more so than for other issues, will say that abortion is what decides their vote for or against a candidate. That's like very high on a lot of people's lists. So it plays a very big role in polarization. Yeah, and that example will come up quite a few times today too. So, okay, yeah, last one.
In my older age now, as my family and siblings are, I find polarization within my family.
Yeah, so we're gonna talk about it, how it affects families. Yeah,
Oh.
how does it affect yours?
Don't
Positively or
you ever
negatively?
talk about this. Don't ever bring that.
Yeah, negatively, right? Yeah,
And,
Yeah.
you're sitting, ooh, scary.
it's hard to talk.
We came from the same
Yeah,
lot but there are definitely isolated. Maybe I'm isolated, I don't know.
mhm. This makes it harder to relate to other people, to talk to them, to feel goodwill, feel comfortable around them. Yeah, there's an interesting.
As long as you stay off of the.
There is an interesting study that was done, I think it was in Trump's first election. They measured how many people within families, how much they disagreed politically, and then how long their Thanksgiving dinners were. You can guess what the result was. People who disagreed more had shorter Thanksgiving dinners. So it can affect kind of like everyday life. Okay. Oh, there's so many people.
Just a short one.
Okay, short one. Okay.
I think even with neighbors,
Yeah.
I think I'm
yeah.
very reluctant to put any political signs in my yard anymore.
Yeah, right. That's
Don't want to destroy any relationships you have
Yeah.
with neighbors.
so all kinds of community, not just our families, our broader communities, our neighborhoods. Yeah.
I think it's also brought a lot of confusion about the role of the state in the church and the role of the church in the state. And
Yeah,
that's
that's gonna
really
come up a lot.
caused a lot of polarization as well.
Yeah, and what's going to come up today is some ways in which we'll see that sometimes politics can influence the church in ways that you may not realize. And probably none of us want that, right? We don't want, that is to say, we don't want people who are in government deciding how we function as a church, right? But we'll see some ways in which that can happen. All right, really the last one, but this is great. You guys have so many thoughts. Yeah.
I've been
Yeah.
in politics. I've been boots on the ground.
Yeah.
I'm term limited. So I'm interested in what you're going to say.
Cool.
Because I've seen both
Okay.
sides.
Yeah, and I'm also very interested to learn from you guys because I'm young. I don't have as much experience as you do. I'm also in the ivory tower, so to speak, a lot, right? So you guys have a lot more in-person experience than I just personally do. I just have my own anecdotes. Okay, so let's get to some of the material. So not shocking, political polarization is at an all-time high. Now it's important that there's two different kinds of polarization. Actually, the word polarization is used in a lot of different ways. It's actually used in three different ways, but I'm going to focus on two. So I'll just say the first one and the other two will be up here. I'll take that away to not confuse you. So sometimes when people mean polarization, they mean just literally how far apart two people's beliefs are. Like one person has the view that no abortion ever and under any circumstances, and somebody else has the view you can have an abortion up until the last second. Like that's just how far apart they are. That's one kind of polarization. But the kinds of polarization that people actually find affecting democracy more are two other kinds of polarization. These are the ones I'm going to focus on. One is partisan polarization. So this partisan polarization, it's not just how far apart is a single belief, like abortion, you're way on this side or way on that side, but it's how much when you go out to vote or when you think about issues, how much are you like Republican, 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 or Democrat, 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 Democrat? So like, do you take the Democratic view on immigration and abortion and war and economics and gun rights, whatever? You take all the Democratic views, then you have a lot of partisan polarization. Or if you take all the traditional Republican views, you just say anything that the Republicans traditionally say, you say that too. That's partisan polarization. You just line up your beliefs with whatever that party says. It can also show up with respect to how you vote. You just always vote this way or always vote that way. So the one way of measuring this is straight ticket voting. So that's like when you just vote for one side. This is at the highest levels it's been since people started measuring this in 1952. Yeah. There's another kind of polarization. This polarization is how much do you just like your beliefs stick with whatever the party line is. But we don't just have beliefs. A lot of times when you guys are worried about a polarization, like in your family, it's not just, oh, people believe differently. I mean, can be a problem too, but it's like people feel badly towards each other because of what they believe. So this is a different kind of polarization. This is called affective polarization. We feel more animosity towards the opposing party than we traditionally have. So some statistics, people who are upset with the child marrying somebody from the other party in 1960 was 4%. Any guesses what it is today? Or this is 2010 that they did this study. It's probably worse now. Any guesses what it was in 2010? What's your guess? You want to say 60? 40. So, I mean, it's not quite, maybe it's 60% today, but yeah, as of 2010, it was 40. So 10 times more. Even that can affect families, right? You have families, people with different views at the dinner table, and people don't like that so-and-so is with so-and-so or whatever. That's problems. Okay. So here's another example of this. This is a study from this book, Radical American Partisanship. Do you ever think would be better off, they asked a bunch of people this, do you ever think would be better off as a country if large numbers of the opposing party in the public just died? I think this was taken, I know it's so bad, right? I think this poll was taken during COVID, so it was like kind of more salient in people's minds. You can see here, this is blue is Democrats and red is Republicans, between 15 and 20%. Democrats more so in this case than a Republican. Oh, I know, I have the same reaction. Oh, it's awful. Okay, so we've got these two kinds of polarization we're going to talk about. How much do your beliefs just line up with whatever your party says, and how much do you dislike people on the other party? These two things can affect each other. Sometimes because we dislike people, we don't want to believe the same thing as them. And other times, as I'll talk about later, sometimes because we don't believe the same thing as them, therefore we feel bad feelings. Don't worry about that too much now. That's just a preview of what's coming. Okay. We talked about some reasons that polarization is bad, just how it affects our neighborhoods, our families, affects churches sometimes, as I'll talk about. It's also been shown to correlate, although the social science literature on this is kind of complicated. So if you ever want to talk more about this, like we should go find social scientists and really get the details. But there's at least a good number of studies that suggest that it's correlated with higher willingness to condone violence, more willingness to infringe on the opposing party's civil liberties, and more support for expansions of executive power when people are polarized. It's not that if I ask Marsha, are you okay with this taking away people's civil liberties? And Marsha's polarized. She's not going to be like, oh yeah, that's fine. That's not quite how it happens. It's just when people actually go out and vote in practice, they actually vote that way. They don't think necessarily that way. It's just how they kind of end up voting. Okay. So a couple things. Let's do the violence one just to have some more fun examples. This is for a study by a friend of mine. Anyone seen the trolley problem before? No. Oh my gosh. Okay. So this is the trolley. It's going to hit this family. This is the Griffin family. I was never allowed to watch these shows as a kid, but if you pull the lever, it's going to go over and hit Homer. Okay. How many people pull the lever so that the trolley hits Homer? Just hits one person instead of 5. Okay. Some of you probably if you thought of it, maybe more of you guys would, maybe not. Okay. So this is the sort of philosophy question people ask all the time in philosophy to students, all kinds of things. There's a bunch of fun variations of it, but here's the variations I did for this study. They had somebody who was here, like pull the lever. It's either going to hit a family of people from their own party, or it's going to switch tracks and hit a neo-Nazi. Predictably, a fair number of people were like, yeah, that's okay. Go ahead and hit the neo-Nazi. So they switched the lever. Then they didn't do this all in sequence, so people didn't really realize what they were doing. But then they asked people a little bit later, different context, like, you know, a little bit later in the study, so they weren't connecting all the dots. Okay, now there's a member of the other party there. How willing are you to flip the switch? Any guesses as how the member of the other party compared to the neo-Nazi? They were the same. Yeah, there was no preference between sacrificing a member of the other party and a member of the neo-Nazi for this particular study. Again, when you're looking at social sciences, you really do need to look at a number of studies, but some are sort of illustrate a point well, and this is a point that's been shown in different ways. Okay, the last one, there was a dog. Members of your own party, or you can flip it to switch the dog. I don't know. It was some cute puppy or something. You guys think people preferred the dog or the person from the other party? They rather kill. Yes, that's right. So they had a greater preference to sacrifice the member of the other party versus a puppy. So this, again, this is like the kind of thing where I was saying in practice versus in principle. If I just ask, sorry, Marcia, I'm sure you're a wonderful human being. I'm just here right here. If I was to ask Marcia, is somebody from the opposing party worth less than a dog? She wouldn't say, yeah, they're worth less than a dog. But if you like in practice ask these kinds of questions to people and they don't realize what they're doing, in practice, they end up kind of making these kinds of choices. So this, all you all who don't think polarization affects you, me, this probably does affect us. We all probably have some subconscious kind of like biases in this way, for better or for worse. For worse, probably, but okay. All right, so that's the setup. Polarization, bad. Got that. Okay. Now what's the role for the church in this? What's the role for religious communities? Well, a lot of times in political philosophy, historically, religion has been seen sort of as like a bad thing. Most of political philosophy is secular people. They're very nice people, but you know, it's often been seen as religion's often seen as a big bad thing. This is John Rawls. He's a major political philosopher of the last 50 years, and he talks about religion as like that's the thing that started the European wars. So like we need to get religion out of politics. It's more subtle than that. But he writes, religion introduced into people's worldview a transcendent element not admitting of compromise that forced mortal conflict and could be moderated only by circumstance and exhaustion. That was his view. And then he argued, so we should take religion out of politics. It like really pumps people up. They fight more, take it out. Okay, so in line with that kind of concerning view about religion, I'm going to start with thinking about how religion can contribute to conflict or can contribute to political polarization. So that'll be the first half of the talk. There'll be a lot here about how religion can contribute to political polarization. Then the second half of the talk, I'm going to say, but wait, there's a better way. Religion can also function to help depolarize and kind of mediate, be a moral mediator between people in different groups. Okay. All right. Any questions, concerns so far? All right, that's a longer intro than I meant to be, but it's okay. All right, so I'm gonna have kind of this metaphor throughout. Political polarization is when religion as a political polarizer is when it like adds boosters to the ship. Okay, it's like, adds more oomph. And later I'm gonna when I talk about religion as a moral mediator, I'm gonna use the metaphor of adding a rudder to a ship. This is a ship that's trying to get through some murky territory. Religion can also kind of function as a rudder. We'll get back to these metaphors later. Okay, so polarization. How can religion contribute to polarization? Well, a couple of things. First, I'm going to argue that religion can strengthen our moral attitudes. Whatever your moral beliefs or attitudes are that come from a religious context, religious context will often, not always, none of this is an always thing, but can often make those attitudes stronger, add oomph to them. And then I'm going to show some ways in which those strong, oomphy beliefs that we have can be hijacked by politicians, by partisan ends. And then they take those like strong feelings that we have and like channel them into politics. And then that can lead to polarization. So it can be hijacked. I'm going to talk a little bit about, I'll try to talk a little bit about both sides, how Democrats and Republicans can hijack religion. But I am going to focus a little bit more on the Republican side. And it's not because I have anything against Republicans. The community I love is Republican, all that. It's just that in the United States, a vast majority of people who talk about religion as being very important to them, they lean towards the right. So it's just like the way that things are on the ground in the United States, at least, is that there has been more of an overlap between religion and conservative Republicans, more so than with Democrats. In other countries, it could be different. I mean, there's nothing like intrinsic about Republicans, just how it's worked out in the US. And so a lot of examples tend to come from that direction, because that's just like in the US, most people who report religion being very important sort of tend to lean to the right. Okay, so is that, you guys got that? I'm not, if you feel that there's bias later, like definitely tell me. I'm definitely not, don't have like any personal issues with people. Yeah. Yeah.
Political right. Weighted.
The evangelicals do make up a large, the people who report that religion is very important to them and that lean to the right, there is a big portion of that is the evangelical, yeah. Okay. I'm also, secular citizens can also be subject to polarization. I'm not saying they can't. I'm just focusing on one case at a time, so I'm focusing on religion for that reason. Okay. Want to see what's the log in RI before we get to criticizing secular people. Okay, so first, religion, I'm going to go through this part a little bit fast. Religion can strengthen our moral attitudes. There's two ways in this can happen. One is that it gives a theological grounding to a moral belief that you might have. So it makes a moral belief you have, gives it deep roots. I'm going to talk about deep roots, and also gives it a wide sort of roots in some theological commitments. So to give you some examples, for instance, with same-sex marriage, you know, there's people who are secular who also believe same-sex marriage is wrong or problematic in some way. If you're religious and you happen to have that belief, then you've got something that secular people probably won't have, which is that you'll have a deeper commitment that undergirds that commitment that you think same-sex marriage is wrong. Why? There's something deeper. Because God, was one way to put it, God created Adam and Eve rather than Adam and Steve, is sort of one way people put it, right? So you have this like fundamental, it's not, of course, not all religious people think this way, obviously, but I'm just saying this is something that can happen. You have a fundamental view maybe about God's purposes in creation. That gives your moral belief a lot more depth and like it anchors it down, right? It's a lot of extra, this is something that to you now isn't just about that belief, it's about God's purposes in creation. So there's like a deeper oomph there. Theology can also, connecting things to deeper existential beliefs about God's purposes, can also tie things to a wider set of practical teaching. So for instance, maybe someone's views about same-sex marriage might be connected to the role of men and women in the family structure, authority structures in the church, masculine and feminine virtues. Theology can link that one belief about same-sex marriage to a whole bunch of other things. Right. So if you believe one, then you feel like it's in this tighter, it's this whole network of things. And then it's like, well, now if I change my belief about same-sex marriage, maybe that challenges my beliefs about the family and about family structures and authority and everything. So that too gives that belief a little extra oomph, like it tightens it up, right? It's tied to all these other beliefs that you have. Also, interestingly, there's some evidence to suggest that if you do sacraments or rituals around a belief, that also makes you more invested in it. And that's something that religious people do that secular people don't do as much, maybe. So we maybe have a lot more sacraments and rituals going on around marriage, and that tends to increase people's investment in something if they have sacraments and rituals around it. Regardless of what the thing is, this is just an effect that tends to happen. Okay, so one thing that can strengthen people's moral attitudes is theology, which ties it down deep and also connects it to a lot of other things. We're doing okay? Any questions? Okay. Connected to our identity in various ways. So this is one thing that adds like a booster, right, to a belief that we might have. Okay, the other thing is not just the theology, the doctrines that we believe, but also our community context. I don't think echo chambers are also always bad. We have an echo chamber where everyone believes slavery is wrong. That's okay. That's good, right? So people use echo chambers as if they're always there. They're not. I'm not saying they always are, but churches can act as echo chambers in the sense that there's a lot of people who believe the same things who talk to each other. There's two theories about how echo chambers work to make people more polarized. One is called persuasive argument theory. This basically says if you hear the same arguments repeated, you're more likely to be persuaded by those arguments and hold those beliefs more strongly. If you're in a religious community that meets every week, and people have the similar views, you're going to hear that stuff repeated more, so you'll probably believe it more strongly. The other theory is called social identity theory. This theory says that if your belief is tied to your sense of belonging or identity in a group, you're more likely to be persuaded and to hold that belief more strongly. So like in the church that I grew up in, same-sex marriage was considered wrong. And if you went a different way on that, people might look at you a little bit like, ooh. And so that can, for any situation where you're part of a group and you're like the one outlier, there's some social pressure to like not be the one outlier. And so if there's a number of people in church who believe the same thing, it can, again, whatever the beliefs are, it can strengthen that. Okay. I think for the sake of time, I won't go through the examples, but does that make sense to people? Okay. Okay, so religion can strengthen our moral attitudes by theology and also by putting us in this community where other people think similarly. Like I said before, this can be a good thing. Sometimes it's good to have strong moral attitudes about things, right? The church, religious organizations played a big role in abolitionism. They played a big role for MLK and civil rights movement. So sometimes it's good to have strong beliefs. It's not saying, this makes it bad. It's also, if you have strong beliefs, it doesn't necessarily contribute to polarization every time, because polarization isn't just about whether you have a strong moral belief. It's about whether you dislike people from the other party. And it could be that you have strong moral beliefs on both sides of the aisle, right? Like you could have strong moral beliefs that are like pro-immigration and anti-abortion or something. You could have two strong moral beliefs. And if you had those two strong moral beliefs, you wouldn't be opposed to a particular party. You'd have, be kind of across the board. Okay, so how does this contribute to political polarization? Well, political polarization can happen when people take these strong moral attitudes, and then instead of having like a complex array of different attitudes where you're maybe liberal on some issues and conservative on some other issues, politics can hijack our thinking about our moral issues within the church, and it can kind of like push us all to one side. So now we think of religion as tied to all the conservative issues, for instance, or less frequently in the US, think of religion as like pushing for all the liberal issues. Like we can think that religion is on somebody's side politically, and that can influence how we think about our moral attitudes. So I'll give some examples of that. Okay, so it's more concerning. What's concerning is when politics kind of like hijack our strong moral attitudes and turns it into fights between the parties. Okay. All right. It's particularly concerning when there's a lot of complex issues at stake. It's not just like a very clear thing like slavery is wrong, but something that's more complex. Abortion has some complexity to it. You know what I mean? So that's where the really strong feelings get to be more of a problem. Okay, there's two ways that I want to argue that these strong attitudes, strong moral beliefs can be hijacked by partisans for partisan ends. One is called political manipulation, and the other is political insulation. Okay, so I'll do political manipulation first. There's a couple steps to this. The first step is, okay, there's a bunch of people who hold some beliefs really strongly. I'm a politician. I want people to come vote for me. It makes sense for me to choose some issues that those people who believe very strongly that connects to them, right? I want them to come vote for me. It makes sense for me to choose issues that speak to them, that speak to people who really believe what they believe. Does that make sense? So politicians will often, it can happen at least, that politicians can select their positions to cater to, who are the people who believe things strongly? We'll find a position that matches their belief. Okay, that's maybe not the end of the world yet. Just, okay, we have somebody representing us religiously. Okay. But then there's a bigger thing that is a problem, which is they can use that strong investment that they get by convincing you about one or two issues to generate a more general identification with the party. So if I'm Republican, then it would be like, I get you on my side by being anti-abortion and being maybe against same-sex marriage or something. And I get you really riled up about that. And then this is the really crucial problem. And then I'm like, yes, we Republicans are the good guys. The Democrats are the bad guys. I go from just saying, I agree with you on these issues to make it a more general, we're the good guys, they're the bad guys thing in politics. So there's various kinds of names for this in the social science literature. If anybody wants the references, you can let me know later. Okay. So we are the good guys. They take your attitudes about a couple issues and then say, we're the good guys. We're going to fight for you. More generally, we're the good guys and other people are the bad guys. So this can lead to affective polarization. Why? Because with we're being the good guys, it's the other guys are then they're the bad guys, right? The Democrats in general are bad. Like They're the God-hating, whatever ones. You can make this even more salient to people by talking about like attacks on religious liberty or the war on Christmas to really make it look like when Democrats do something that they really intentionally like have it out for religious people, whereas, maybe it's actually more complicated what's going on in these cases. Here's Bill O'Reilly with the war on Christmas. I found another fun one. This is the Biden who stole Christmas. I thought that's one of it. You can see it's like, it's portraying Biden as if he's anti-religious more generally because of this one issue. Okay, so that can contribute to affective polarization. It's also, you can really make the other person look bad because it's not just that they got some moral issue wrong, it's that you can say that they are set against God, that can kind of like add extra oomph to it. Okay, so sort of beware, this can happen. People can say, oh, the other people are bad in general because in these issues, they have a different view. Okay. It can also contribute to partisan polarization where you can use a couple issues, you get people to really identify with your party on those couple issues, let's say abortion, same-sex marriage. And then you use those issues not just to vilify the other party, but also to get people to agree with your party on a whole bunch of other views. So two ways this can happen. One is that once elites, this can be politicians or media, have vilified the other party as the bad guys, then you're not going to take seriously what the other people say anymore. So if I've already portrayed the other party as God-hating or attacking religious liberty, and then they come along and they're like, I don't know, I don't hate God or whatever, then it's like, if you're kind of suspicious of them, you're probably not going to hear out what they have to say as well. You're probably going to be more suspicious. So you probably won't hear or understand their arguments as well. Or maybe someone comes as a Democrat, comes with a pro-immigration story, and but you're like, you don't want to listen to what they have to say because those Democrats already. Okay. Oh, here's the example that I actually had, which I should have used, is like he's saying like, okay, where God hates abortion. I mean, that's complicated. I'm just saying, but you could have that view, right? And then saying like, oh, kind of using that as leverage to get people to be Republicans more generally, and then getting them to sign on to being okay with the death penalty. Because now they've identified with the Republican Party and the Republican Party is more pro-death penalty. But you could see that like, at least potentially might be some tension between these. I mean, I know it's complicated, but I'm just saying there are people who on a religious basis will say like, oh, well, we should protect fetuses. We also shouldn't have the death penalty. My point here is just that you can get so tied up in your political identity that you end up accepting views that may or may not actually align with religion, with what religious theology would say. Was there a question over there? Yeah.
I had an experience about 50 years ago. A corporate executive said, would you like to go to Washington, D.C. in the fall of 1975? I said, okay, yeah, I said, so I went and I listened to a group of political leaders from the Republican Party. I was a Republican. I was in support of Jerry Ford. About halfway through, I said, who are we supporting? We are supporting Ronald Reagan. During those 3 days, Roe versus Wade was like in 73, right?
Something like that, 72, 73.
73. This is 2 years late after that.
Mhm.
There was not one mention that I remember about abortion.
Yeah, so that's
It was
interesting. Yeah.
it was regulation and corporate tax.
Yeah.
Now, these were religious people who were concerned, or at least these were politicians who were concerned about those issues, taxes and regulation. In the next 4 years, Jimmy Carter was elected and Jerry Ford was defeated. A lot to do with, he wasn't very helpful in Ford's election. But during that period of time, I think the Christians there decided that at this meeting, and I was one of them, decided that we can't convince masses of people to vote for us on the basis of corporate
Interesting.
taxes and regulation, but the issue of abortion
Get more people on board.
can get where we want to go.
Yeah.
By 1972, I've read some old articles about church leaders at that time. It was almost a one issue. That issue of abortion was used to create many, many, many decisions in politics that were not for the Christian,
Yeah.
but that's
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 really
how it
interesting
happened.
example. Yeah. So Putnam, there's this really famous sociologist called Robert Putnam. And he works with this other guy, David Campbell. They wrote a book called American Grace. And he talks about how in the last 2-3 decades, they talk a lot about how politicians have really capitalized on these like hot button issues to draw people to their own side. Yeah. Like more to draw people, it's not just about the issue. It's like, we're the good guy kind of thing, to draw to that kind of dynamic. So, okay, so we had the good guy, bad guy dynamic. That was a really good example. Thank you. But the second thing that, as to kind of continue on that, is it's not just the good guy, bad guy dynamic that can happen, but also that if I'm the good guy, then I can maybe persuade you to get on board with other things in my political platform that maybe don't actually have that much to do with religion, or at least don't have as much support religiously. So there's an article by Dawson in 2019 talking about how the NRA, and I'm not saying the NRA is the most horrible thing ever. I don't know much about the NRA, but this article shows how they used religious language to get people on board with God-given right to bear arms. Where, you know, at least, I mean, that's not as clear in the Bible as, you know what I mean? Like, that's not, I mean, okay. So the thing is, but if you use that language, sometimes you can get people on board with other political things that maybe didn't have that much to do with religion initially. And that leads to partisan polarization. Partisan polarization, again, being where like you line up with what the party says about whatever it is they say, that you go with that party. Okay. I'm gonna, for the sake of time, skip this example. Okay. So the second example, the second kind of way that politics can kind of infiltrate religion, one is by how politicians can manipulate religion to kind of for their own ends. Another is political insulation, and this isn't something that politicians do so much as that we do. So this is a book that came out in the last 5-10 years by Michelle Marilie called From Politics to the Pews. She shows how a lot of believers select religious communities to provide support for or that align with their political position. So when people go to find religious churches, there's less of an emphasis now maybe than there used to be on, you know, what are the details of their doctrine? Like, are they good Calvinists or are they good whatever? There's more in practice, like, do I feel comfortable here? And a lot of that turns out to be like, do the other people kind of like jive with me politically? A lot of people end up choosing churches, maybe it's subconsciously, but they end up going with churches where other people share their politics. That seems to become more of a priority because politics has become so important to our identity. And this has some negative effects too on polarization. So before I talked about echo chambers, and I said, in general, religious institutions can function as echo chambers. It's not always bad, but maybe it is bad when the echo chamber is not just sort of a general religious view, like life has dignity or slavery is bad or something, but it's a more specific political echo chamber. That is to say, now it's other people in my church don't just share the same theology, we also share the same politics. So when I'm talking to other people, that's probably going to strengthen not just my theological views, but the political stuff too. So it becomes this kind of double echo chamber. So it can strengthen my investment in a partisan subset of the religious values. So maybe if I had been in a more diverse church, maybe if I'd been in a more diverse church, maybe I would have heard, I'm just going to keep using the same examples, but maybe I would have heard like more pro-immigration stuff from some of the Democrats. I would have heard more anti-abortion stuff from some of the Republicans. I would have heard a little bit of like, you know, views from both sides about how religion could support both sides. But if I'm in a church where most people have the same political view, then probably I'm going to end up hearing all the religious arguments for one side of the issues. So congregations tend to emphasize one side of partisan debates when people in that congregation tend to be, you know, sort of one side or the other politically. So immigration was the example that I just gave. Okay. So that was that's one example. Another example is I went to visit a church that was on the more liberal side, and I knew a lot of people at this church, and I know from having been to church enough that you could probably never say something that was, I mean, being pro-life in that church would have been sort of weird. It was a liberal church. So they had this, somebody who was Catholics for Choice come in, and she gave this like very passionate talk, but they like didn't have anybody on the pro-life side come in. You know, so it's because most people there were Democrats. And, you know, it's like, so, but then this means that you're hearing one side of the arguments and you're connecting those arguments to religious views that you have. Okay. So this can lead to, I'll just finish this one slide, I'll come back to religious fortification, where you can start kind of subconsciously reinterpreting religion to reinforce your political beliefs. Because it's like, hey, all the people, like it's very easy to find arguments to support your side when everybody is on the same side from the Bible, you know, or you pick up the arguments that sort of support your side. So in either way, and there's some biblical passages that you could go either way. That's a complicated debate on the abortion issue. Yeah.
Yeah, there are people who have left their church because of the position that the church has taken.
Yeah.
You know, in other words, you know, the church might be pro-abortion, and the people would say, "Oh, but I am for abortion," and so they left that congregation.
Yeah.
Same thing with same-sex marriage.
That is my next example.
Or gender identification.
Yeah.
You know, that it's caused people to leave religion.
Yeah. Or leave a church or whatever because of different views on that. And I mean, I understand this is like very heavy stuff for people. So it's not like I'm like, oh, you're evil for doing that. But these are the effects when too many people start leaving churches because of different political views, then you end up, a lot of people think the same thing and you get more polarization. So I grew up in the Christian Reformed Church, like I said. So one thing that can happen is that we can start reinterpreting or just emphasizing passages that support our politics. There can also be a component of like, we start making some issues really central to Christianity that maybe wouldn't have been as central if we had been in a more diverse, politically diverse congregation. So some of you know, the CRC voted a year or two ago to say that if you think same-sex marriage is okay and you want to do that in your church, you can't be part of the domination anymore. So for me personally, and I'm not a theologian, but to me that was surprising. I was like, is that so important? Like, that's what's fundamental to us? Like, for me, that was surprising. And so one concern you could have is that maybe this became so central because it was so important politically and people were like already mad about it politically. And then this became an issue in the church too. Maybe it wouldn't have been as much if churches had been more integrated. Okay. So political insulation, where we be or with other people who think the same thing, and then we fortify our political beliefs with our religious values because it's easy because we all, you know, can easily emphasize that. That can lead to partisan polarization for sort of obvious reasons, like it's easy for me to think everything that the Democrats think or everything that the Republicans think if everybody around me who I'm super close to religiously is like thinks the same things, and become an echo chamber and lead me to think more of the same things and find more passages that support a variety of Republican views or support a variety of Democrat views. It can also lead to affective polarization, where we dislike each other more. One thing is like, once I can connect the Bible, or think at least that I'm connecting the Bible to my politics, then it really becomes like, to be a Christian, you have to agree with me politically. Right? Now, part of the reason I think that the Bible supports my politics is because of this other political stuff. So I was maybe not totally right about making that connection. But once I make that connection, then it's like, you're not really a Christian if you don't think the same way about this issue. And then that can, like, it's a very deep part of my identity. Christians think this. And that means that like people who think differently, well, they are like bad people, right? It's very easy for that to happen. So you can vilify the other party when you've got this thing that's become so deep to your own identity. And also, if your closest relationships where you talk to people and you do rituals together, rituals tend to have a bonding effect on people. It's going to be hard for you to realize like, oh, maybe the Democrats aren't evil because like all the people you're super close to are Republicans. Or it can happen the other way around. I've definitely seen this happen the other way around too, or like at the schools I've been at. secular schools are like, everyone, somebody knows is a Democrat. They don't understand how Republicans think, and then they just think, oh, Republicans are evil because we're thinking this way, right? So my point is, when you're around a lot of people who think similarly, it's very easy for you to start thinking that other people, the reason that they think different is because they're bad in some way. It's easy for that to happen. Okay, and that can happen in churches too. Okay. All right, so this was all the bad news. The bad news was religion can strengthen our moral attitudes, and then those attitudes get hijacked for partisan ends, co-opted by politics. So it's influencing us to think certain things. We think that it's religion making us think those things, but really it's these political influences, political manipulation or political insulation that I'm around a lot of other people who think the same thing as politically. All right, how are we doing? I've got like 15 minutes. Okay. All right. So for some people, like for Rawls, he's this really big political philosopher. He thought, okay, this is why we keep religion out of politics. And he had a mandate for religious restraint, which was like his argument was religious people shouldn't bring up religion when they're talking about their political views. Like they should just keep their religion out. It's going to polarize them. So there's this worry, right, that it's like adding a lot of oomph to our boat. And it's going to like, we're not going to be able to get through this like rocky river. Okay. All right. So now some good news how religion can function as a rudder. It doesn't just have to be bad, like a booster for polarization. Okay. So religion as moral mediator. I'm going to skip over 2 slides, but go to this slide. Okay. Okay. So yeah. Yeah, but I wanted to leave time for questions. So I was trying to do 15 minutes. That's the goal. And I know you guys have been talking somewhat in the meantime too. So I was like, yeah, thanks. Oh, that's very nice of you. That's very nice. Okay, so I'm going to suggest that religious citizens, really everybody, but I'm just focusing on the religious case for today, should consider these 2 virtues that they might try to develop. One is a virtue of conscientious inquiry, where they inquire about the reasons for their contested religious beliefs. So I have, there's some some political debate about same-sex marriage or abortion or whatever. And rather than just going with what politicians say or whoever says about this is the Christian view, consider looking into some theology. And like, there's a lot of, not just theology on your side, and complicated theology, theology, there's oftentimes theology on both sides of complicated issues because the issues are complicated. So that's one virtue. I'm going to talk about how that can be helpful. And the other virtue I'm going to talk about is empathetic engagement. That is developing relationships of mutual understanding and goodwill with members of the other party. These are often going to be important to do together because oftentimes it's very hard for us to take other people seriously when we hate them, right? Or we feel mistrust towards them or suspicion for them. So it's actually it's going to be important, we'll see, to have both of these where you get to know people so we don't hate them. Then it's easier to understand their arguments, take them seriously. Okay. All right. So those are the 2 virtues. I'm going to argue if we do these 2 things, we can help depolarize the church and also America more generally, at least help. Okay. And it's going to interact. Both of these things are going to interact with the same things that I said can make religion, make our beliefs really strong. The theology and the community context. I'm going to argue these things, we can actually use these things to our benefit if we exercise these 2 virtues. Okay, so potential for depolarization, part 1, conscientious inquiry. Okay, so inquiring about the theological grounding of your beliefs. So one, maybe obvious thing is it can help prevent religious fortification. Now, this is the term that I was using when you fortify your political views with religious values or things from the Bible. You think, oh, that can support the political thing I want to think. If you do this kind of theological inquiry, it can keep politicians and congregations from artificially producing support for one side of their political debates. So you might see that there's passages in the Bible that could potentially, I'm not a theologian, but that could potentially be read on either side of the abortion debate. As an example, same-sex marriage is obviously complicated. There's a lot of people who have written about that. Something like the God-given right to bear arms, you might be like, oh, turns out I'm not a theologian, but you might be like, oh, turns out there wasn't as much support from the Bible for like guns per se, or whatever. Okay. Same on abortion. You might find, like I said, there's things in the Bible that you can find that seem maybe to support both sides. Okay, so that can help fight partisan polarization. So you're not just believing whatever your party says is the right thing to believe and identifying that with the Christian view. That's one thing. It can also help fight affective polarization, where affective polarization was the one where we don't like each other. Because when you understand somebody else's moral reasoning, you're much less likely to think they're evil. Right. So if I think the reason that you are pro-choice is because you hate babies, like, okay, well, then I don't like you because you hate babies. That's bad. Or if I think the reason that you're pro-life is because you hate women, it's like, you don't care about women's choice, then it's like, oh, well, they just don't care about women. I don't like those people, right? But if I can go understand deeper theology, deeper arguments on both sides of the aisle, I might be able to understand, oh, maybe, I mean, I'm sure there are people out there who hate babies and who hate women. However, like most people, there's more complicated than that, I think, probably. And when you inquire about the arguments on the other side, especially from a theological, biblical point of view, you could be like, oh, I see how somebody who's not crazy or somebody who's not, hate babies or hate women could end up with this view. There's some other deeper stuff going on there for them. So it can help fight affective polarization. Okay, there was my abortion example I just gave. Okay, so that's conscientious inquiry. I'll do empathetic engagement now. This addresses that community aspect. So while conscientious inquiry kind of addresses like the theology aspect, it can help work to our benefit, because if we do good work in theology, we can realize there actually are often arguments on both sides that can work to our benefit. Similarly, with empathetic engagement, having the fact that we have religious communities can work to our benefit, so long as those communities aren't all the same party within the community. So if they're more mixed communities, then you can get some good benefits out of that too. First, you can develop goodwill towards people that you've formed relationships with. So like most of the people in the church I grew up in were mostly Republican. And that's why I mean, because I knew them, I loved them and I cared about them in a way that my secular friends who didn't know any religious people, like my secular friends, didn't really like religious people because they didn't know them. They didn't understand, I hadn't had good experiences with them. I had good experiences with them. So it was easier for me to have goodwill towards them and not just think, oh, the reason these religious people are opposed to abortions because they just don't care about women. Like I never had that thought because I had seen men care a lot about me in the church, right? So you've had those experiences in person with people from the other party. It's a lot harder to minimize or just make it very one-dimensional, say, oh, this is just the way they are, or whatever. You get to know that actually they're decent people and there's more complication there. Okay, so it can fight affective polarizations. You don't just like dislike people on the other side so much. It can make us vilify other people less. Can also make it within religious networks, we vilify people on different political views less, but also politicians who try to vilify the other side and say Democrats are all anti-religious or whatever, like they won't be as effective if they try to use that ploy because you might know some Democrats who are religious, right? So they also can't stoke more affective polarization that way. Okay, it can also help fight partisan polarization. Again, partisan polarization is where you believe everything that your party believes. Because if you trust people on both sides, then you're more likely to take their arguments more seriously. Once you know them, you're more willing to you have goodwill towards them, you trust them, they're decent people, you'll probably take them more seriously. And I think this is I kind of mentioned this before, but I'll just say again, I think this is a really important supplement to conscientious inquiry. Sometimes it has happened, I've seen it happen at least, where people say like, people who think this way about abortion, they're not real Christians, or people who think this way about same-sex marriage are not real Christians. And then it's like, well, I'm going to look at all the Christian views on abortion, but people who think differently, they're not real Christians. So then I just, keep going. But all the Christian views I define as views that agree with me, right? Because I've said anyone who disagrees with me on this issue is not really a Christian. So then if I'm in that mindset and I try to inquire about theology, but I've just disqualified a bunch of people as not real Christians, but I'm inquiring, then it's like, well, I could inquire a lot about the theology, but never come across anything that pushes against me because I've just said all those people don't count as real Christians or whatever. So I think it's super important in order to have good inquiry that's sort of impartial and balanced as much as possible, to get to know people that sort of, you can be like, oh no, this person is a real Christian. You've seen them, show up Sunday after Sunday, really be devout, etc. So you don't just disqualify people, so then you take their arguments more seriously. Okay, how are we doing? I've got one more little section. Any Okay, one more last little section. Okay. So far, I've said religion can be bad for politics when it's hijacked by partisan influences. It can add these boosters to the ship of state, and get us, it's very bad for when we're in murky, difficult territory of politics. Now I've suggested there's some ways it could be a rudder to help our ship of state like get through these murky territories more easily, more sort of with more nuance. We see arguments on both sides. We know people on both sides of the aisle. So we're not just charging ahead through these rocky waters. The last thing I want to do is I want to suggest that actually it's possible that religion can not only help depolarize us, sorry, religion can be a positive force so that it's not causing polarization, but is stopping polarization. That's kind of what I just suggested. If you exercise empathetic engagement and conscientious inquiry, it can help stop polarization within the church. But now I want to go a step further and say, actually, religion can actually be a positive thing where there's actually religion has positive, maybe, things to offer to the country that maybe secular citizens don't in some respects. Now, I think secular citizens have a lot to offer, but here's some things that religious people might have to offer to help depolarize the country more generally that maybe secular citizens don't have as many resources to do. I'm going to introduce this person, Celia. I'm going to call Celia secular. So I'm just going to have a concrete reference point. So given our current institutions, a secular citizen like Celia is likely to lack, first, regular exposure to a long-standing ethical tradition which she can draw on to critically analyze her political views. Okay, so it's a long sentence, but the idea is when you go to church every week, you go to Sunday school every week, maybe you read some theology, every week you're getting some education in a long-standing ethical tradition, a tradition of thought, of moral thought, ethical thought, seen through a theological lens. And that, like I've been saying, it could give you some resources to critically analyze political views. Remember, I said you could find theological arguments on both sides, which could give you good resources for analyzing, different political things. Secular citizen like Celia, she may not be going to something that's the equivalent of church every week. So she's not getting that same kind of regular exposure, to some longer standing tradition that she could use to critically analyze political views. So Kirk, pretend Kirk is a Christian, Kirk in German is Kirche, is church in German. Okay. Kirk is my religious guy. He can use his theology, and now he's inquiring about his theology, so he's getting a nuanced view of different sides of issues to bring depth to what might otherwise be shallow partisan disputes. So if you take out, take this out, take Kirk out, he doesn't have any education or any exposure to deeper ethical thinking, then it could be just that politics just becomes, you're bad, you're a Democrat, you're a Republican, you hate women, you hate babies. But now if Kirk has done some deeper digging, and his church has been done a good job of like providing some arguments and thinking on both sides, he could say, oh, here's some deeper issues, here's some deeper things we might think about. One example, does anyone know the doctrine of double effect? Okay. It's going to be too complicated for me to explain here, but it's a doctrine that originated, many people attribute it to Aquinas, who's a famous Catholic philosopher, and it has played a huge role in philosophical debates about abortion, and it helps give a lot of nuance to abortion debates, right? So that's like something where if you can take something from a religious tradition and figure out how to translate it into language that other people can use, you can add depth to a debate. Probably have some other examples. I mean, in the paper that I have on this, I give examples of people who are Muslim and who are Confucian as well. So like Muslims within Islam, you're not supposed to take interest on loans. And they have a lot of theology behind that, a lot of thinking and arguments. So they could probably contribute to, debates about economics, like provide some morally interesting stuff. Confucians have a lot of emphasis on etiquette. I'm simplifying, but there's some interesting papers that really show the ethical importance of etiquette. So it's not just like, oh, be polite, but it's like morally, you should be polite. That could be helpful for politics, right? If they bring that in and show us some of the arguments about why that's valuable. Okay, so these deeper resources in religion can help add substance and some interesting things to politics. So it's not just like, you're bad, no, you're bad, you're whatever. Yeah. So it can add some depth potentially. Okay. Another thing that a secular citizen is likely to lack, maybe more likely than Kirk, our religious guy, to lack, It's a well-established moral community that transcends party politics. So this guy, Robert D. Putnam, I mentioned before, he wrote a very famous book called Bowling Alone. Has anybody heard of this? Do you want to say what the basic ideas of Bowling Alone? It's kind of in the title, but
Well.
yeah, just keep it as concise.
Giving a very, very succinct analysis, and it's probably about 30 years old, if
Yeah.
I'm not mistaken. But what he saw was that even though there was an increase in the number of people bowling, the revenue that bowling alleys accrued decreased because people were bowling alone rather than in bowling leagues. There was not that communitarian aspect. And that carried over into participation in social organizations as well. Parent-teacher associations in the school, et cetera, et cetera. et cetera.
Rotary
So that was
clubs,
correct. So
all
that
that kind
was
of thing, yeah.
basically the gist of his book.
Yeah. So Robert Putnam showed how people were doing more things alone. There was fewer community networks to hold people together. This was, like you said, about 30, gosh, what year are we in? Probably 40 years ago at this point. It was a long time ago, but those community organizations, they haven't like come back. It's not like all of a sudden now. There has been more social media, but social media is obviously pretty different from these community organizations where we actually get to know each other face to face in a bowling league or whatever. Social media also tends to be very politically segregated. I can say a lot about social media, but my point is people tend to be more isolated overall than they used to be. So secular citizens maybe have less access to like solid community structures than maybe the average religious citizen does. Because there's, religious citizens, at least, I mean, the church is kind of trickling in population, but it's still there, right? So there's still somewhere to go on Sundays. There's still like a lot of places where you can go for community. Somebody like Celia may not have as many places already built in that she can go for community. Also, you could add in that she there's this like breaking news all the time. There's a lot of hype around politics, like, oh, it's the end of the world because this has just happened, and social media, oh, it's the end of the world because this has just happened. So she maybe, and I'm not saying this is all secular citizens, I'm just, some possibilities. Less places for community, a lot more emphasis on like parties, political parties, party identity. It's possible that like she could really then cue into politics as what her community is. The good people, the people are the Democrats, or are the Republicans. So whereas somebody like Kirk could be like, look, in theory, if he has a church where there's people who are different religions, different political parties, Kirk could be like, hey, we have a deeper identity. Me, Kirk, and Marilie and Sue. There's something deeper that we all share as part of the church that's not just our politics. There's like a deep bond there. There could be a deep bond there. For somebody like Celia, she may not have a place where she can go where there's like a deeper bond, that transcends party politics. So then it might be that like the political parties kind of become her religion. You know what I mean? It's like, that's kind of where she finds community. And that's like, there's no deeper community. It could be just like the political party kind of becomes my community. So somebody like Kirk can then use the communal context he has and empathetic engagement, by which I mean this, he could become part of churches where there's more political integration. And he will, in that kind of a church, he will probably build some skills that Celia might not have as easy access to. So if he's part of a politically diverse church, he will learn to talk to people with different political views, right? And how to love people and how to care people and how to be scared, how not to be scared of people on the other side, how not to think they're evil. Those are really good tools that he could learn that it might be harder maybe for Celia to learn if she doesn't have a place where she can go, it's deeper like that. So he could then maybe, if he really develops those skills, churches could, they could be good basis for hosting like inter-party, like bipartisan debates between things, right? They've kind of learned the skills they need to have debates between people on different sides of the party, and then they could go out and sort of share that with the world, right? They can show other people that this can be done in various ways. So if we do this, then the sacred community can put partisan disputes in their right sort of earthly perspective. And this brings me back to Rawls. This is the guy that I work on most of the time when I'm not talking about this. But you might remember at the very beginning, I said, religion introduced to the people's worldview a transcendent element, not admitting of compromise, forced mortal conflict, blah, 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 right? like this transcendent element was so bad. But actually, the transcendence that he blamed for Mortal Kombat could help put politics in its right earthly place. Because we know that there's something deeper, something more important, something more valuable is our community, our commitment to God that's deeper, draws us, bonds us together at a much deeper level than whether you're a Republican or a Democrat. And so it can help put all those like political fights that feel so intense and can really become almost like religious wars, help put them in perspective. Like that's not the end all be all. There's something else that's deeper here and that's more important. Okay, that's it. Thanks a lot, guys. Happy to take any questions. All right. Good evening, Lily.
Thanks for a stimulating lecture. Really appreciate it.
Yeah.
I think it's impossible to separate religious values from society. Now, it may be necessary to isolate sectarian values from American society, but if you think of the founding fathers, all men are created equal, endowed with certain inalienable rights. That's just not picked from Aristotle or Plato. I mean, part of that's picked from scripture and other religious. And then there's in the American history, we couldn't have had a republic without different layers of sovereignty. State, local, national government. And eventually, we're moving toward universal suffrage, and there's a consensus building that what does democracy depend on? It depends on a candidate or a party getting the majority vote. The Republican Party was primarily formed in the 1850s to protect the majority. The slave power, as they called it, even prevented a discussion of slavery on the floor of the Congress from 1836 to 1845. And so now you have, I think since 1988, with the election of Bush Sr., whom I voted for, you've had only 2 Republicans out of that X number of elections who won a majority of the vote. And something has happened in American society that didn't happen since the 1850s, which led to the Civil War, that currently we're all right with minority presidents. We have current one who's running again lost the most previous election by over 7 million votes. What's the basis of democracy if the majority doesn't have the right to select a national candidate? And part of that we have to realize it's incumbent in a conflicting system because you have various layers of sovereignty. But one of the things that's going to bring us together is a belief in that all men are created equal, endowed with certain inalienable rights. I also went to the Christian schools. I have 8 good buddies. Oh, now 6 are left. But friendship can overcome sectarian beliefs, believe me.
Oh yeah,
We have great discussions. Thank you.
Yeah, a couple of things on that. So the first thing, when you say you can't isolate religion from politics, that may very well be true. I guess there's 2 things I would say on that. One is that I think what you did say was key, was that maybe you can separate sectarian things from politics. So Rawls, this guy, he was not actually like totally opposed to religion in general. He was kind of like, when you use religion, try to use it in a way so that you're emphasizing shared values. So like human dignity has a religious basis, but also it has studied ethics in graduate school, a Kantian basis. There's a philosopher named Kant who also has the same view, and possibly utilitarians, depending on how you interpret them. But so yeah, I mean, there's a lot of things that have a religious basis, but maybe also have secular or other bases, and Rawls at least thought we should emphasize the shared things. Yeah, I mean, with respect to the Constitution, I'm not a historian, but I do know, and I think there's a lot of excellent, from what I understand, there's arguments on both sides. I mean, certainly religion certainly had some influence there, but also, there's Jefferson, other people who are sort of deists and not really that religious. So yeah, it's a bit complicated. The sovereignty thing, I don't have that much to say on that. I wasn't quite sure what the connection to religion there was, but I will say one thing that's interesting from what I understand is that in the early pilgrims in like Plymouth, one of the ways that like majority vote became a thing was that in the churches, the church elders had a practice of deciding in whatever the particular churches were there, had a practice of deciding things by majority vote. And that had some influence historically. So, but I don't know if it's just a religious thing or not. I mean, it's interesting. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think there was one here that I saw second.
I've got one. It seems that there's different views of reality. We're not sharing the same reality. If reality is a mosaic with a bunch of little tiles and each tile is a fact, there's one camp that has exhibit A reality that they're basing their decisions on. And camp B has a whole different view or understanding of reality. And the logical consequence is political polarization, because they can't grasp the same reality. And that's pretty sad. I think that's what largely gives rise to polarization, although it's the chicken or the egg, which comes first, because you look at through your political lens, at which facts you're going to accept, which facts you're going to reject. But that's part of what's happening.
Yeah, I definitely think that's part of what's happening. And I do think that there's a big component of that comes from affective polarization, where people don't like or trust each other. There's a philosopher, last name Nguyen, who makes the argument that like a lot of times people they could, even if they become aware of arguments on the other side, that they'll just disregard them because they don't trust those people. So he argues that the first step to dealing with the problem you're talking about is to get to know people so that you have some basis for trust before you start trying to talk about things where you're going to write off what they say anyway. Yeah, you had your hand up way earlier. Yeah,
I did.
Yeah.
How do you explain Christian nationalism?
It's okay.
I just speak very softly apparently.
That's okay.
How do you explain Christian nationalism
Yeah.
within this concept that you've been talking about?
Yeah, there's a couple great books that have come out recently on Christian nationalism, and I have yet to read them because I have not finished this project. But one thing I can say is that when I talked about political manipulation earlier, I said, well, if I'm a politician and I want to get a lot of people to vote for me, one thing that would be wise for me to do is to find something that a lot of people care about strongly and then like appeal to them, right? And religious values are things that can make people feel strongly. And also, a majority of people in the US are white. And I don't know if you guys have heard the phrase white Christian nationalism. I'm going to white Christian nationalism because a majority of Christians who are nationalists are white. Okay. So then I can like, well, what are the things that the white Christians think? And that's kind of what makes sense for me as a politician in some ways. You could see the incentive to do that. So the place it would fit in was with the political manipulation bit. That is to say that like it makes sense for me to appeal to what a majority of people would feel strongly about, white Christians, what they would feel strongly about. How can I get them on board with my program? And Christian nationalism would be one way. And it's also, it can be easier for me in that context to vilify other people. So one feature that's often highly correlated with Christian nationalism is thinking that minorities are bad in some way. If you're in the majority, it's easy to go to a church where everybody else is in the majority. Like you're not forced to mix with other people as much. If you're a minority citizen, you more often end up having to go to a church where there's people who don't look like you. So you kind of learn to understand them better because you kind of have to mix with them more, whether it's just church or more generally in society. Like you're kind of forced to be with people who look different from you if you're a minority. So it's especially easy for politicians to take people who are in the majority, who are white, who have strong beliefs, who are Christian, and turn them against people who are in the minority just because they don't have they're not as forced to mix with people in the minority as people in the minority are sort of forced to, they can't help but, look like people. But yeah, that's a great question. I need to go read the relevant books to give more details.
Along the same lines, is there any data to support what I think I see and feel? That a lot more of us Americans are okay with the idea of a theocracy. And when I grew up, I didn't know anybody that was in favor of that. And I meet people all the time that are in favor of that now.
That's interesting. Yeah, that's
Yeah.
going to the question of the Christian.
But data on how many people feel that way. Is there any data on that?
I don't know. I think it exists. I don't know the exact,
Okay,
but
because I just feel that.
sort of
I'd like to see numbers.
Yeah. I don't know the details on that, but with respect to, what was your name? Yes, Linda, the white Christian nationalism. So Christian nationalism, it's not like everybody who identifies that way also believes in theocracy, but there's some overlap. And there has been a documented increase of white Christian nationalism. So there's some documented increase, but I don't know the percentages. Yeah. That's pretty intense. I don't know. Yeah, wow. Yeah.
I'm not sure if I exactly have a question, but you said it would be wise to do this thing, but it's cynical, opportunistic manipulation. This is not wisdom. We are full of a system that's full of lying, cynical manipulators. I don't know how to say it any other way. They're not religious people talking to religious people. They're people who have something to gain by cynically manipulating people.
Are you saying, because I was saying it would be wise to engage with people who think different politically?
It's like, if that is wisdom, then give me fools.
Wait, because it's wise. So I want to make sure I understand this, because I'm saying it's wise to engage with people who think differently politically from you.
You were saying that if you were trying to appeal to Christians.
I used the word wise. Yeah, okay, so that was not the right word.
I know maybe you didn't
strategic.
mean it that way,
It's
but
strategic.
it was like nails on a blackboard for me. It was like, oh my God.
Strategic is a better word there. I agree. Yeah.
This is getting away from religion a little bit, but I think one contributor, a large contributor to the polarization is that I think human beings look to simplify things.
Yeah.
And our lives are so complicated. You think about insurance, you think about investments, you think about getting a new cell phone or a new car and trying to figure out how to make the darn thing work. We're looking for ways to simplify. And a lot of people don't have the time like we do to watch political broadcasting all day and figure out who the good guys and bad guys are. So if they know that this is their team or that's not their team, it just makes it so much easier so they can set that aside and know who they're going to vote for and then figure out how to run their new lawnmower or dishwasher or whatever it is.
Yeah, no, I think that's 100% true. There's this really famous study in sociology. I'm forgetting the name of the author right now, but if you email me, I can tell you what it was. But they did it's something that's called like, if anybody here did sociology, can remember this, raise your hand. It was like minimal group something. But basically, so they like took some kids at a camp and they're like, you are the blue stars and you are the red stars. And like, just said nothing, I mean, very little else, just very minimal. You're part of this group, you're part of that group. And long story short, by the end, they just like hated each other. Just very minimal, just like you're part of this. And so our sense, there's been a lot of political scientists who have talked about how our sense of identity, good guy, bad guy, is very fundamental to our thinking in a lot of areas. And it's also, shows up in politics, good guy, bad guy. It's simple. And for me, this is like a really, 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 well, there's a couple things about it. One is, I think, when things are simple, you can feel a sense of control. Like, I'm the good guy, they're the bad guy. And whatever they do, I just need to oppose that or whatever. Like, my people are going to win, whatever. It's like, that feeling of certainty, I'm the good guys, is really a great feeling. It feels really good to feel really sure of yourself, right? Gives you confidence, you're walking out there. But it has these really bad side effects because it makes things too simple. We're the good guys, they're the bad guys. That's generally not the case, you know? And so for me, there's this huge virtue with humility, which is learning to let go of certainty, obviously, but it's also because it's learning to let go of that sense of confidence that comes with being certain. And and I actually think this could be a religious virtue, giving it over to God in a way. It's like, I don't have to be confident about everything. Why? I am not God. You know what I mean? Like, it is more complicated, and I can be okay being humble and being unsure about something. And I think it's such an important virtue for people to learn to be humble. And because of that, like letting go of the control and the confidence that comes with feeling like I'm right and you're good and I'm bad, or I'm good and you're bad. Yeah.
Going from what you just said, in your study, to what degree does fear play into polarization?
Yeah.
I'd like to be very, very confident that I am absolutely 100% wrong. I'm also fearful that I might not be right. And so if I can use fear
Yeah.
as a politician, as a
Yeah.
pastor, or whatever,
Yeah.
play in and tap those deep-seated fears to propagate a particular political, religious perspective, you
Yeah.
know, from a strategic
Yeah. Not a wisdom,
mechanism.
but a strategic.
Yeah, from a
Yeah.
strategic mechanism, that works really
Yeah.
well. So I'm
Yeah.
just curious,
Yeah. There's
what you've found in your study.
Yeah, there's something called a negativity bias that if you tell somebody some bad news and some good news, like they'll tend to focus more on the bad news in general, not in every case, but there's sort of a trend. Or, you know, when you hear like feedback for department stores, it's like, who are the people who give their feedback? The ones who have negative things. So there is a bias that people have to pay more attention to negative information. Fear is attached to that. And so there is like some documentation around that captures people's attention more, fear does. And my people, I don't know what people's views are on evolution, but if you're into that, like there could be an evolutionary explanation for that, right? Like evolutionary probably makes sense for us. People who are afraid will stay alive longer because they'll avoid the animals longer. But we have to be aware. Oh yeah, like my fear can really have subconscious effects on me that I don't even realize. All of us. That's not a particular political party. That's all of us. Yeah.
I have one comment. I am wondering if the term Christianity itself has been hijacked by a particular party. And I know your Pew study early on had a percentage of people that commit to going to church or whatever it says. It was more 50%. So I guess that's one of my deeper concerns. It's not just aligning with the issues, but if you start hearing all Christians believe this, all Christians believe that, the evangelical Christians believe this, this, and this, I'm really concerned that that doesn't influence maybe some in your communities of care and concern that want to do a deep dive. They don't have to do a deep dive because they've already been told all Christians believe this. And I would probably not fall in that camp, although I would claim myself as being a Christian.
Yeah. I mean, it is strategic to some extent for if politicians can get that into people's heads, this is the Christian view, my view. Like, well, then they've got a lot more people voting for them. So, you know, in the US, I mean, moral majority in the 80s, et cetera, like there's an argument to say that it's more the Republican Party than the Democrats, but it could happen the other way around. It could have happened either way. You know what I'm saying? But yeah, I think there's an strategic incentive for politicians to hijack that word to get more people on their side. If I can convince you that this is the Christian view, and I've got more people voting for me, all the Christians. Yeah.
I want to thank you for this presentation.
It's my pleasure.
I'm pretty old and I couldn't keep up with you. Sometimes you were talking fast and I could listen to this 3 times over and probably get some more info out of it. But changing the subject a little, you're from South Africa, right? And how would you went through apartheid, or you?
My parents left right at the end of apartheid. So my parents left right in 1990, sort of right at the time of transition. So I wasn't personally.
Okay.
Yeah.
Do you see any similarities in Israel right now?
Ooh, whole nother question. I do think, I will say, I do think it is, I have views on that issue. However, I was not brought here to, that is not my expertise. But I will say something I can speak to. I think the same thing with like party identity being manipulated to make you believe one way or the other could play into there too. This is what, if you're a true Christian or if you like Jews, you're going to believe this way. Or if you care about Muslims, you're going to believe, or if you're a Democrat, if you're a that those kinds of fears, the feelings of identity or Democrat, Republican, I think can have a large subconscious effect on how we process information. And in particular, I think it can make us distrust information from the other side or not look into it. So, I mean, I'm just going to say an argument that exists. I'm not going to try to push it, but an argument that exists, and I've seen many people make this argument, is that, while horrible things have happened in Israel, that, whatever that number is times 10 have happened to Palestinians because of response. Now, not my area of expertise. My point is, if you just write that number off, that's not the case because, those people are just anti-Semitic or whatever, then that's some of this stuff that's operating because you're just distrust the other side. You don't take. So it does the inquiring about what's going on and is important.
I always thought I was anti-Semitic, and I'm having confusion here, but I'm not anti. I'm for to the Jewish nation to have a homeland, but I'm not for what Netanyahu is doing there. Now,
yeah, maybe
am I anti-Semitic or am I not?
Yeah, I'm not going to get into that. However, I will say using terms like that too quickly sometimes can be a way of writing people off. So we should be careful. Yeah. I'd be happy to talk about that afterwards. It's just I shouldn't pontificate on that because it's not my expertise. I've got one question up here. Sure. I mean, I'm happy to stay, but I know the time's technically out.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, it seems to me that we have moved societally from a consensus, like with the CBS guy, Walter Cronkite.
Oh, yeah.
And the television stations, Fox Nation and MSNBC, or the so-called mainline media, have weaponized this, and they say, we are the truth. We are representing what you need to know. You don't need to go anywhere else.
Yeah.
But with us. And that's the downfall of our society, in my view. I'm working harder now than ever at reading the National Review and Fox Nation and trying to broaden my understanding of where people are coming from.
Yeah.
But those are the kinds of sources that are not being lifted up in our society to be the common good. What is the best way forward in the face of our partisanship and our divisions? And that's what I think we need to find leaders to do, is to like you've been saying, build bridges between people instead of building walls, which has been it's going on every day. We're building walls between each other, and we need to work at breaking them down. Thank you.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And that's one of the things people also contribute polarization to, is that there used to be more centralized, like couple people, like people watch the same couple news shows like everybody did. So they someone were talking about alternative realities before. We live in different worlds. It used to be less so because there were just fewer news sources. And now it's like, what do you think? Like, what is your position on this? You can find some news source that will support you on that position. You know what I mean? Right. Silo, yeah. Online, on TV or whatever. So that does make polarization worse in some ways. Now, it's probably good to have more than just one news story. Like, it's probably good to have some variety, but kind of got to be aware of the importance of taking advantage of the variety rather than using the variety to like just find whatever it is you want to believe and get support for that. Yeah. Yep.
We could keep going, but I thought this was the last one. Do you would?
Let's do one last one. People need to leave. That's fine.
I couldn't agree more with the gentleman that just spoke. When I am going to get in an discussion with someone before we start, I say, tell me where you get your news. And then I say, and tell me now, who do you fact check with? And people, most of them our age, look at me like, well, what's that? You know, I listen to MSNBC, I listen to Fox, I don't fact check. They don't know to look to all sides, PolitiFact. There are Annenberg, University of Florida, they all have fact checking devices. You can check with 4 or 5 things before you start believing some of these outrageous, hateful things that come from all sides. So, you know, I think I would give a national lesson on this. If I could do it, I'm a teacher and I would get up there and give a lesson
I mean,
because
yeah.
we need it, you know?
Yeah, it's the difficulty is that people then don't trust the fact checkers. And so why don't they trust the fact checkers? Well, it's probably because they don't know enough people on the other side of the aisle that they have some trust in. I was going to say something about that. Fact checking. Yeah. All sides. Okay. Yeah, I know what I was going to say. Oh, one thing I was going to say is even if you think the other side is nuts to think whatever they think, it's still valuable to go read their stuff. Why? So you can understand why the other person is thinking what they think. So you can actually engage with them. Yeah.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you
Thank you.
for today.
Bye.